There's a war cemetery in Yangon, Myanmar, that most people will never visit. It's called Tokyan, and it's the largest Commonwealth war cemetery from World War II. Over 6,300 soldiers are buried there, their white headstones stretching toward the horizon under the tropical sun. But that's not what makes it remarkable. Standing at its center is the Rangoon Memorial, the largest memorial to missing soldiers from the entire Second World War. It commemorates over 26,800 men who died in Burma and have no known grave. This is the story of the Burma campaign, one of the longest, deadliest, and most completely forgotten battles of World War II. A war that lasted nearly 4 years, a war that killed hundreds of thousands, a war that soldiers themselves called the Forgotten War. And they were absolutely right. Act 1. The Collapse. When most people think of World War II, they picture very specific images. The D-Day landings on Normandy beaches, Spitfires dueling over Britain, tank battles in North African deserts, the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific. Burma doesn't even register in the public consciousness. It's a blank spot on our collective memory of the war. But for nearly 4 years, from 1942 to 1945, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought and died in a campaign that stretched across mountains, that scraped the clouds, through jungle so dense you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, and into monsoon-flooded valleys where the water rose faster than you could retreat. It was a war fought in terrain so hostile that disease killed 5 times more men than bullets. A war so remote that supply lines were measured not in roads, but in how far an airplane could fly before running out of fuel. A war where soldiers genuinely believed the world had forgotten they existed. Because it had. Let me set the scene for you. It's early 1942. The Japanese military is rolling through Southeast Asia like an unstoppable wave. The speed is breathtaking and terrifying. Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day, 1941. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore falls in February 1942 in what Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies collapse. The Philippines are being overrun. And then there's Burma. Burma mattered for 2 critical strategic reasons. First, it was the back door to India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. If Japan took Burma, they would share a border with India, and the British feared a Japanese invasion might trigger the uprising that would finally end colonial rule. Second, Burma contained the Burma Road, a winding, dangerous supply route that was the only way to get weapons and supplies to Chinese forces fighting the Japanese. If Japan cut that road, China might collapse, freeing up millions of Japanese soldiers for use elsewhere. So Burma had to be held. But the British forces defending it were woefully unprepared. They were a mixed collection of British units, Indian Army divisions, and Burmese soldiers with outdated equipment and virtually no air support. They had commanders trained for the last war, not this one, with no conception of how to fight an enemy like the Japanese. By May 1942, after just 5 months of fighting, Burma had fallen, the entire country. The retreat was catastrophic. General William Slim, who would later become the architect of victory, called it the longest retreat in British military history, over 900 miles from Rangoon, in the south to the Indian border, through jungle and mountains, during the beginning of monsoon season, when the rains turn the world into a waterlogged nightmare. But here's what makes the 1942 retreat even more horrifying. The soldiers weren't the only ones running. When the Japanese invaded, panic spread through Burma's Indian and Anglo-Indian population. Rumors spread about Japanese treatment of civilians, about massacres, about what would happen to those who stayed behind. and so they fled. Around 600,000 civilians attempted to escape Burma in 1942. 600,000 people trying to walk out of the country simultaneously through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They walked through jungle paths that were barely paths at all. They climbed over mountain passes where the altitude alone killed people. They had no food, no medicine, no shelter. Children died in their mothers' arms. Old people collapsed on the trail and were left behind because there was no choice. You kept moving or you died. Act 2. The Jungle Enemy. Imagine trying to fight a war in a place where the map is basically useless because you can't see more than 20 feet in any direction, where the jungle canopy overhead is so thick you can't tell if it's noon or twilight, where the humidity is so crushing that you feel like you're breathing water, where sweat soaks through your uniform within minutes and never dries, where your weapons rust overnight if you don't constantly clean them, where leeches drop from trees onto your neck and burrow into your skin, where your boots literally rot off your feet within weeks from the constant moisture, where every tiny scratch, every minor cut, becomes infected and refuses to heal in the damp heat. Soldiers couldn't dig proper foxholes because they'd fill with water faster than you could bail them out. You couldn't light fires to cook food or warm yourself because everything was perpetually soaked. Soldiers learned to sleep standing up, leaning against trees, because lying down meant lying in water. Your clothes never dried. Your skin pruned and rotted. Trench foot was rampant. Feet that swelled up, turned white, became infected, and in the worst cases had to be amputated. And yet, despite everything, despite the disease, the terrain, the isolation, the feeling of being abandoned by the world, the Allies had to find a way to fight back. Because by 1943, the strategic calculus had changed. If Japan held Burma, they threatened India. If they threatened India, the entire British position in Asia would collapse. More than that, the only way to supply Chinese forces was through air routes over Burma. The whole Pacific War effort hinged on this jungle that most people couldn't find on a map. Act 3. The Chindits. Enter Brigadier Ord Wingate, one of the most controversial and fascinating officers the British Army ever produced. Wingate was brilliant. Wingate was eccentric. Wingate was probably half mad. He ate raw onions like apples. He wore an alarm clock on his wrist instead of a watch. He quoted the Bible constantly and brushed his body hair with a toothbrush instead of bathing. He was exactly the kind of officer that conventional armies hate, and exactly the kind of officer who might have the solution to an impossible problem. Wingate's idea was simple in theory and insane in practice. Long-range penetration groups. Soldiers who would march deep behind Japanese lines, completely cut off from any ground support, supplied entirely by aircraft dropping supplies from the sky. They would live in the jungle for months at a time, sabotaging enemy supply lines, blowing up bridges and railways, ambushing Japanese patrols. Most importantly, they would prove that British forces could beat the Japanese at their own game, that Western soldiers could operate in the jungle just as effectively as the Japanese. The force was called the Chindits, named after the Chinthe, the mythical lion-like creatures that guard Burmese temples. The name was perfect. Fierce and protective, but also deeply connected to the land they'd be fighting in. The force was made up mostly of British and Indian troops, along with Gurkhas, the legendary Nepalese soldiers who'd served Britain for over a century, and Burmese soldiers who'd escaped the Japanese occupation and wanted their country back. In February 1943, the first Chindit expedition marched into Japanese-held Burma. 3,000 men simply walked across the Chindwin River and disappeared into the jungle. Their mission: march all the way to the Irrawaddy River, deep in the heart of Japanese-controlled territory, blow up railway lines, destroy bridges, attack supply dumps, and prove it could be done. Then, somehow, make it back alive. For 3 months, the Chindits operated behind enemy lines. They blew up sections of the Mandalay-Maitkina Railway, cutting Japanese supply lines to the north. They destroyed bridges. They ambushed convoys. They were a constant thorn in the side of Japanese forces who couldn't pin them down and couldn't predict where they'd strike next. But they paid a terrible price. The jungle took its toll on everyone. Malaria ravaged the columns. Men weakened from disease and short rations. Wounded soldiers had to be carried or, in the worst cases, left behind with some supplies. Japanese patrols got better at tracking them as the months wore on. By late April, Wingate made the difficult decision to withdraw. The columns turned west, back toward India, each one finding its own route back through hostile territory. Some made it across the Chindwin River in good order. Others were hunted by Japanese patrols every step of the way. Some columns broke up entirely, with men making it back in 2s and 3s, stumbling into British lines weeks after their units had been written off as lost. When the survivors finally staggered back to India in May 1943, they'd lost 818 men. That's 27% of the entire force. The soldiers who did make it back were, in the words of an official military report, racked with disease and in dreadful physical condition. Many were hospitalized for months. Some never fully recovered physically. Act 4. The Forgotten Army Strikes Back. By 1944, the war in Burma had fundamentally transformed under Lieutenant General William Slim and his 14th Army, the army that called itself, with bitter irony, the Forgotten Army. The name wasn't chosen lightly or as a clever marketing slogan. These soldiers genuinely believed that the world had forgotten they existed. While newspapers back home obsessed over the fighting in France and Italy, while Hollywood made movies about glamorous pilots and heroic tank commanders, the men in Burma fought on in complete obscurity. No reporters came to visit the Burma front. No celebrities toured to boost morale. Mail from home took weeks or months to arrive, if it arrived at all. It hurt. One veteran, interviewed decades after the war, captured the feeling perfectly. We joked about being the Forgotten Army, but it wasn't really a joke. It hurt. We'd fought just as hard as anyone, died just as much, suffered just as much, but nobody cared. Nobody even knew where Burma was on a map. But William Slim cared. And Slim understood what his army needed. He took forces that had been beaten, demoralized, and riddled with disease, and transformed them into one of the most effective fighting forces of the entire war. He did it not through dramatic gestures or stirring speeches, but through meticulous attention to the details that actually keep soldiers alive and fighting. First, he revolutionized logistics. In the jungle, traditional supply lines were impossible to maintain. Roads washed away in monsoons. Rivers became impassable. So Slim embraced air supply completely and systematically. Everything, ammunition, food, medicine, replacement troops, even entire field hospitals, was dropped from aircraft. Units learned they could be cut off from ground supply and still keep fighting effectively because the planes would come. That psychological shift was enormous. Japanese encirclement tactics, which had caused panic and collapse in 1942, no longer worked. Second, Slim completely overhauled the medical system. Disease was killing far more men than combat, so he made it his personal mission to change that reality. Medical units were improved and expanded. Supplies of anti-malarial drugs increased dramatically. Soldiers received training in basic hygiene measures that actually worked in jungle conditions. Strict enforcement of anti-malarial discipline began, including mandatory taking of mepecrine tablets. The results were dramatic. Disease casualties dropped from that horrifying 120 to 1 ratio in 1943 to nearly 1 to 1 by 1944. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Slim rebuilt his soldiers' confidence and morale. He visited units constantly, not just officers, but ordinary soldiers. He explained clearly what they were fighting for, not in grand imperial terms that rang hollow, but in simple, human terms they could understand and believe in. Then in March 1944, the Japanese gave Slim and his 14th Army the opportunity to prove everything they'd built. Operation Yugo was Japan's last great offensive in Burma, nothing less than an invasion of India itself. Japanese commanders believed that if they could smash through Allied defenses and establish a foothold in India, they might trigger a massive rebellion against British rule that would knock Britain out of the Asian War entirely. They attacked 2 targets, Imphal, a major Allied base in the border region, and Kohima, a small hill station that controlled the only road to Imphal. If they could take both locations, they'd cut off the entire Allied position and open the door to India. The battle for Kohima became one of the most intense, brutal, close-quarters battles of the entire Second World War. The Japanese surrounded the small town. The Allied garrison, initially just about 1,500 men, held out in a perimeter that shrank day by day under constant attack. The fighting was savage and personal. At one point during the battle, the front line literally ran through the deputy commissioner's tennis court. British and Indian troops held the tennis court itself and the bungalow on one side. Japanese forces held the clubhouse and the garden on the other side. They were so close they could hear each other breathing. They threw grenades at each other across what had been a recreational space for colonial administrators playing weekend matches. For 16 desperate days, the garrison held out, was completely surrounded, being supplied only by airdrops, fighting hand-to-hand battles in the ruins of what had been a peaceful colonial hill station. When relief forces finally fought their way through, the garrison was down to about 250 men still capable of fighting. But they had held. They hadn't broken. At Imphal, the fighting was on a much larger scale, entire divisions slugging it out over weeks and months in brutal combat. Japanese forces encircled the Allied base, cutting it off from the ground supply. Slim's response was textbook application of his new doctrine. He ordered his forces to hold their positions, form defensive boxes, and let the Japanese wear themselves out, trying to break through. Meanwhile, Allied air superiority meant that supplies kept flowing into Imphal, while Japanese supply lines, stretched impossibly thin over mountain passes, began to collapse under their own weight. By July 1944, the Japanese offensive had failed. Completely, catastrophically failed. Japanese forces retreated back into Burma, leaving behind thousands of dead and dying soldiers. The casualties were staggering. Japanese forces suffered approximately 55,000 casualties during Operation Yugo, including about 13,500 killed in action. But the real numbers were actually worse than that, because the majority of Japanese casualties didn't die from bullets. They died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The same jungle that had defeated the British in 1942 now destroyed the Japanese in 1944. The same monsoon rains that had covered the British retreat now turned the Japanese retreat into a nightmare march of death. The Burma campaign cost over 1 million Allied soldiers their service, with approximately 71,000 British and Commonwealth casualties, including 14,000 killed. Japanese casualties exceeded 185,000, mostly from disease and starvation rather than combat. Hundreds of thousands of Burmese civilians died. Yet when the war ended in August 1945, Burma was forgotten almost immediately. There were no victory parades for the 14th Army, no celebrations. They came home quietly to a nation that had moved on to other stories, other heroes, other battles that fit better into the narrative people wanted about the war. Those 26,800 names on the Rangoon Memorial represent someone's son, husband, father, brother, men who died in places without names, in battles nobody recorded, fighting a war the world forgot. Like, share, and subscribe if you like this content. Drop some suggestions below. See you soon.